He looked at Teresa, who shifted from foot to foot. You okay? He asked. I'm fine, she answered with a small smile, just anxious to get it over with. Amen, Sister, Minho said. When Newt finally had everything gathered, he called for quiet, and Thomas turned to hear what he had to say. There's 41 of us. He pulled the backpack he was holding onto his shoulders and hoisted a thick wooden pole with barbed wire wrapped around its tip. The thing looked deadly. Make sure you've got your weapons. Other than that, isn't a whole lot to bug and say. You've all been told the plan. We're going to fight our way through to the Griever hole, and Tommy here is going to punch in his little magic code, and then we're going to get payback from the creators. Thomas barely heard Newt, having seen Albie sulking over to the side, away from the main group of the Gladers. Alone, Albie picked at the string of his bow while he stared at the ground. A quiver of arrows hung over his shoulder. Thomas felt a rising tide of worry that somehow Albie was unstable, that somehow he'd screw everything up. He decided to watch him carefully if he could. Shouldn't someone give a pep talk or something? Minho asked. Go ahead, Newt replied. Minho nodded and faced the crowd. Be careful, he said dryly. Don't die. Thomas would have laughed if he could, but he was too scared for it to come out. Great, we're all bloody inspired, Newt answered, then pointed over his shoulder toward the maze. You all know the plan. After 2 years of being treated like mice, tonight we're making a stand. Tonight we're making the fight back to the creators, no matter what we have to do to go through to get there. Tonight the Grievers better be scared. Someone cheered, and then someone else. Soon shouts and battle calls broke out, rising in volume, filling the air like thunder. Thomas felt a trickle of courage inside him. He grasped it, clung to it, urged it to grow. Newt was right. Tonight they'd fight. Tonight they'd make their stand. Thomas was ready. He roared with the other Gladers. He knew they should probably be quiet, not bring any more attention to themselves, but he didn't care. The game was on. Newt thrust his weapon into the air and yelled, Hear that, creators? We're coming. And with that, he turned and ran into the maze, into the gray air that seemed darker than the glade, full of shadows and blackness. The Gladers around Thomas, still cheering, picked up their weapons and ran after him. Thomas followed, falling into line between Teresa and Chuck, hefting a big wooden spear with a knife tied at its tip. The sudden feeling of responsibility for his friends almost overwhelmed him, made it hard to run. But he kept going, determined to win. You can do this, he thought. Just make it to that hole. Chapter 55. Thomas kept a steady pace as he ran with the other Gladers along the stone pathways toward the cliff. He'd grown used to running the maze, but this was completely different. The sounds of shuffling feet echoed up the walls, and the red lights of the beetle blades flashed more menacingly in the ivy. The creators were certainly watching, listening. One way or another, there was going to be a fight. Scared? Teresa asked him as they ran. No, I love things made out of blubber and steel. Can't wait to see them. He felt no mirth or humor and wondered if there ever be a time again when he would. So funny, she responded. She was right next to him, but his eyes stayed glued up ahead. We'll be fine. Just stay close to me and Minho. Ah, my knight in shining armor. What, you don't think I can fend for myself? Actually, he thought quite the opposite. Teresa seemed as tough as anybody there. No, I'm just trying to be nice. The group was spread out across the full width of the corridor, running at a steady but quick pace. Thomas wondered how long the non-runners would hold up. As if in response to the thought, Newt fell back, finally tapping Minho on the shoulder. You lead the way, Thomas heard him say. Minho nodded and ran to the front, guiding the Gladers through all of the turns necessary. Every step was agonizing for Thomas. What courage he'd gathered had turned to dread, and he wondered when the Grievers would finally give chase. And so it went for him as they kept moving, those Gladers not used to running such distances, gasping in huge gulps of air, but no one quit. On and on they ran with no sign of Grievers. And as the time passed, Thomas let the slightest trickle of hope enter his system. Maybe they'd make it. Maybe. Finally, after the longest hour of Thomas's life, they reached the long alley that led to the last turn before the cliff, a short corridor to the right that branched off like the stem of the letter T. Thomas, his heart thumping, sweat slicking his skin, had moved up right behind Minho, Teresa at his side. Minho slowed at the corner, then stopped, holding up a hand to tell Thomas and the others to do the same. Then he turned, a look of horror on his face. Do you hear that? Thomas shook his head, trying to squash the terror Minho's expression had given him. Minho crept ahead and peeked around the sharp edge of stone, looking toward the cliff. Thomas had seen him do that before, when they'd followed a Griever to this very spot. Just like that time, Minho jerked back and turned to face him. Oh no, the keeper said. Oh no. Then Thomas heard it, Griever sounds. It was as if they'd been hiding, waiting, and now were coming to life. He didn't have to look. He knew what Minho was going to say before he said it. There's at least a dozen of them. He reached up and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. They're just waiting for us. The icy chill of fear bit Thomas harder than ever before. He looked over at Teresa, about to say something, but stopped when he saw the expression on her pale face. He'd never seen terror present itself so starkly. Newt and Albie had moved up the line of waiting gladers to join Thomas and the others. Apparently, Minho's pronouncement had already been whispered through the ranks, because the first thing Newt said was, "Well, we knew we'd have to fight," but the tremor in his voice gave it away. Thomas felt it himself. It'd been easy to talk about the nothing to lose fight, the hope that just one of them would be taken, the chance to finally escape. But now it was here, literally around the corner. Doubts that he could go through with it seeped into his mind and heart. He wondered why the grievers were just waiting. The beetle blades had obviously let them know the gladers were coming. Were the creators enjoying this? He had an idea. Maybe they've already taken a kid back at the glade. Maybe we can get past them. Why else would they just be sitting? A loud noise from behind cut him off. He spun to see more grievers moving down the corridor toward them, spikes flaring, metal arms groping, coming from the direction of the glade. Thomas was just about to say something when he heard sounds from the other end of the long alley. He looked to see yet more grievers. The enemy was on all sides. The gladers surged towards Thomas, forming a tight group, forcing him to move out into the open intersection where the cliff corridor met the long alley. He saw the pack of grievers between them and the cliffs, spikes extended, their moist skin pulsing in and out, waiting, watching. The other two groups of grievers had closed in and stopped just a few dozen feet from the gladers. Thomas slowly turned in a circle, fought the fear as he took it all in. They were surrounded. They had no choice now. There was nowhere to go. A sharp pulsing pain throbbed behind his eyes. The gladers compressed into a tighter group around him, everyone facing outward, huddled together in the center of the T intersection. Thomas was pressed between Newt and Teresa. He could feel Newt trembling. No one said a word. The only sounds were the eerie moans and whirs of machinery coming from the grievers, sitting there as if enjoying the little trap they'd set for the humans. Their disgusting bodies heaved in and out with mechanical wheezes of breath. "What are they doing?" Thomas called out to Teresa. She didn't answer, which worried him. He reached out and squeezed her hand. The gladers around him stood silent, clutching their meager weapons. Thomas looked over at Newt. "Got any ideas?" "No," he replied, his voice just the tiniest bit shaky. "I don't understand what they're bloody waiting for." "We shouldn't have come," Albie said. He'd been so quiet, his voice sounded odd, especially with the hollow echo the maze walls created. Thomas was in no mood for whining. They had to do something. "Well, we'd be no better off in the homestead. Hate to say it, but if one of us dies, that's better than all of us." He really hoped the one a person a night thing was true now. Seeing all these grievers close up hit home with an explosion of reality. Could they really fight them all? A long moment passed before Albie replied, "Maybe I should." He trailed off and started walking forward in the direction of the cliff, slowly as if in a trance. Thomas watched in detached awe. He couldn't believe his eyes. "Albie," Newt said, "get back here." Instead of responding, Albie took off running. He headed straight for the pack of grievers between him and the cliff. "Albie!" Newt screamed. Thomas started to say something himself, but Albie had already made it to the monsters and jumped on top of one. Newt moved away from Thomas's side and toward Albie, but 5 or 6 grievers had already burst to life and attacked the boy in a blur of metal and skin. Thomas reached out and grabbed Newt by the arms before he could go any farther, then pulled him backward. "Let go!" Newt yelled. "Are you nuts?" Thomas shouted. "There's nothing you can do." 2 more grievers broke from the pack and swarmed over Albie, piling on top of each other, snapping and cutting at the boy as if they wanted to rub it in, show their vicious cruelty. Somehow, impossibly, Albie didn't scream. Thomas lost sight of the body as he struggled with Newt, thankful for the distraction. Newt finally gave up, collapsing backward in defeat. Albie flipped once and for all, Thomas thought, fighting the urge to rid his stomach of its contents. Their leader had been so scared to go back to whatever he'd seen. He'd chosen to sacrifice himself instead. He was gone, totally gone. Thomas helped steady Newt on his feet. The glader couldn't stop staring at the spot where his friend had disappeared. "I can't believe it," Newt whispered. "I can't believe he just did that." Thomas shook his head, unable to reply. Seeing Albie go down like that, a new kind of pain he'd never felt before filled his insides. An ill, disturbed pain. It felt worse than the physical kind, and he didn't even know if it had anything to do with Albie. He'd never much liked the guy, but the thought that what he'd just seen might happen to Chuck or Teresa